The city was quieter than usual that evening, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. In the heart of that silence sat Elias Ward, a private detective whose reputation for brilliance had never matched his fortune. He was clever, thorough, and consumed by the thrill of deduction, yet work had eluded him for months. His office, tucked above a dimly lit cafe, smelled faintly of stale coffee and rain-damp paper. Case files lay unopened, not because they had been solved, but because no one trusted a man with a sharp mind and an empty wallet. Elias had grown used to the emptiness, but it gnawed at him. Every detective longs for a puzzle, and he was starving for one. On that particular night, as the city's fog rolled through the narrow streets, Elias leaned back in his chair, cigarette in hand, staring at the ceiling. That was when he first heard it soft, so faint he almost dismissed it as a trick of exhaustion. A melody. It was not a tune carried on the cafe's radio, nor the chatter of late-night patrons below. This music was distant, barely clinging to the air, like the memory of a song half forgotten. A single violin note stretched out, trembling, then faded into nothing. Elias sat upright. His pulse quickened. Moments later, a knock sounded at his office door. He hadn't been expecting anyone. When he opened it, a woman stood there, pale and trembling. Her name was Clara Holt. Her brother, she explained, had vanished 3 nights ago. No signs of struggle, no farewell note, just gone. But Clara insisted that before his disappearance, her brother had spoken of a strange sound at night, a ghostly orchestra playing from somewhere deep within the city. Elias listened carefully. His instinct told him Clara's fear was real. People vanished in the city every day, but the detail about the orchestra clung to him. His own ears had just confirmed it. "I'll take your case," he said at last, surprising even himself. Clara's relief was visible, but Elias knew what he was stepping into. Something about that violin note, about the way it had slid into his mind like a blade of ice, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He extinguished his cigarette, grabbed his coat, and stepped into the fog-drenched night. The music was waiting, and Elias Ward, hungry for a mystery at last, was ready to follow its first note. The streets were slick with rain as Elias Ward followed Clara Holt into the night. Gas lamps sputtered weakly against the heavy fog, their halos blurring into pale smears of light. Clara's voice trembled as she led him through winding alleys, explaining what little she knew of her brother's disappearance. His name was Thomas, an apprentice bookbinder who often worked late, bent over yellowed volumes in his cramped workshop. 3 nights ago he had returned home pale and restless, muttering about hearing music where no music should be. Clara had pressed him for details, but Thomas only whispered about violins that seemed to play from the fog itself. The next evening he left home after supper, carrying nothing but his coat, and never returned. Elias absorbed every word. Missing person cases were often straightforward deaths, crimes of passion, or voluntary flight. But the mention of music tugged at him with unusual persistence. He had heard it himself, faint as a ghost. It was not imagination. It was real. They arrived at Thomas's workshop. Its windows shuttered, the lock stiff from disuse. Clara handed Elias a spare key. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of glue and paper dust. Shelves sagged beneath stacks of half-minted tomes, their cracked spines whispering of forgotten stories. Elias ran his fingers over the workbench, noting an unfinished binding. Beside it lay a scrap of paper almost overlooked. It was a torn piece of sheet music. Only a few bars were visible, drawn with a hand both precise and trembling. The notes dipped and climbed with unnatural sharpness, as though the melody itself fought against its own structure. Elias did not play, yet the marks conjured a suggestion of sound in his mind, a discordant rise, followed by a haunting fall. He felt his chest tighten. Clara saw his expression and grew pale. "He told me," she whispered, "that the music wasn't just sound, that it wanted something." Elias slipped the fragment into his coat pocket, his thoughts racing. If Thomas had found this music, then perhaps he hadn't disappeared at random. Perhaps he had been taken by it. He moved toward the door, preparing to search further, when a faint noise stopped him. Not outside, not distant. It was inside the workshop, behind the rows of books, where the shadows clung too thickly. The scrape of a chair leg, a hush like breath being drawn. Clara clutched Elias's arm. "Did you hear?" "Yes," Elias murmured, eyes narrowing. "We're not alone." The fog outside pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the silence, beneath the thrum of their hearts, a violin string quivered. The sound was so faint that Clara might have mistaken it for imagination. But Elias Ward had lived too long in silence to doubt his ears. Something shifted in the dark, corners of the workshop an unseen presence, stirring among the rows of neglected tomes. The detective stepped forward cautiously, hand brushing the weight of his revolver, though he did not yet draw it. "Who's there?" Elias's voice was steady, but his eyes flicked across the cluttered space, searching for movement. The only reply was a whisper of paper, as though invisible fingers turned a page. Then, from the corner, a figure detached itself from the shadows. A man, or what had once been man, stood there. His skin was ashen, his clothes disheveled, eyes vacant yet shimmering with a strange gleam, like candlelight reflected on water. He held a violin by his side, its bow trembling in his hand. Clara gasped, clinging to Elias's coat. "Thomas?" she whispered. But Elias saw at once this was not Thomas. The figure's frame was taller, leaner, his face gaunt with hunger. He smelled faintly of damp stone and rotting wood, as though he had emerged from a grave. The stranger raised the violin, placed it beneath his chin, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound was harsh at first, like a door hinge groaning, but then it smoothed into a low, mournful tone that filled the workshop. Elias felt the note seep into his bones, into the very rhythm of his pulse. Clara clutched her ears, crying out. "Stop," Elias barked, stepping forward. The man's hollow eyes flicked toward him, but the bow did not falter. The melody deepened, layered upon itself, until Elias swore he could hear not one violin, but many an invisible orchestra swelling around them. The shelves rattled, dust fell in trembling clouds, and the floor seemed to vibrate. With a surge of will, Elias lunged forward, knocking the violin from the man's hands. The bow clattered to the floor, breaking the spell in an instant. The phantom music ceased. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. The man staggered back, his lips trembling. Then he collapsed into the shadows, vanishing as though he had been no more than smoke. The violin remained on the floor, its strings humming faintly, though no bow touched them. Clara's breath shuddered. What was that? Who was he? Elias crouched to inspect the violin. The wood was ancient, carved with symbols too worn to read. He felt an unease coil inside him. That, Elias muttered, wasn't a man, and as he lifted the violin, a single string plucked itself, resonating with a note that felt like a warning. The violin lay heavy in Elias Ward's hands, though its weight was no greater than any other instrument. It was the air around it that seemed denser, charged with an energy that set his skin prickling. Clara hovered close by, her eyes locked on the strange carvings etched into the wood. They spiraled in patterns that almost resembled musical notation, yet no stave or measure could contain their design. Elias turned the violin under the dim workshop lamp. The symbols were faint, nearly swallowed by time, but he recognized fragments of sigils he had seen once in an old police archive, a set of occult markings discovered on the walls of a derelict theater, long since demolished. The report had dismissed them as graffiti. Elias now wondered if they were more than idle scrawl. What do they mean? Clara whispered, voice brittle. I don't know yet, Elias admitted, though his mind was already racing. He tucked the violin carefully into its battered case. But your brother, he may have crossed paths with something much larger than we thought. The workshop felt colder now. The silence after the phantom performance clung stubbornly, as though the walls themselves were waiting for another note to fill the air. Elias urged Clara outside, and the fog swallowed them both once more. On their way back toward the cafe district, Elias detoured to the public library. The night staff recognized him. His face was well known, though rarely welcomed, and reluctantly granted him access to the basement archives. Dust hung heavy in the stale air, stirred only by the flickering lantern Clara carried. Row upon row of forgotten newspapers and records stretched before them. Elias's fingers brushed spines, until he found what he sought. Articles from 3 decades earlier. Headlines spoke of the vanishing audience, a scandal that had shaken the city's grand opera house. An entire crowd, over 200 people, had disappeared during the debut of a symphony written by a composer named Dorian. Vetched, no bodies were ever recovered. Clara's lips parted in horror. An entire audience gone? Elias nodded grimly. And the composer vanished too. His work was banned. Every copy of his music supposedly destroyed. He drew the torn sheet from his coat and laid it beside the article. The notations matched exactly. Clara shivered. Then the violin. Is part of Vetch's orchestra? Elias finished. The words lingered between them, heavy and undeniable. Somewhere in the city, the rest of the instruments might still exist. And if they were ever brought together again, a faint note drifted through the library stacks, soft as breath. Elias froze, violin case under his arm. The music had followed them. The library basement, usually hushed and lifeless at this hour, seemed to pulse with a faint vibration. Elias Ward tightened his grip on the violin, case as the note quivered through the stacks. It was not loud softer than a whisper, but it traveled straight into the marrow of his bones. Clara clutched her lantern tighter. the flame flickering as though threatened by an unseen wind. They followed the sound down a narrow row of shelves, dust motes swirling in the lantern glow. The note lengthened into a phrase, rising and falling with deliberate intent, as though an unseen musician practiced scales in the dark. The strangest part was how the music seemed to come from everywhere at once. Elias raised a hand, signaling Clara to stop. He crouched beside a row of bundled newspapers, eyes scanning for movement. Then, with no warning, a shadow flitted across the far wall too, swift and insubstantial to be flesh and blood. "Who's there?" Elias's voice cut through the silence. No answer, only the faint continuation of the melody. He moved forward slowly, every sense taut. As he rounded the end of the row, the music ceased. In its place came a dry rustle, like paper tearing. On the floor lay an open volume, its yellowed pages fluttering despite the still air. Elias knelt to inspect it. The book was a catalogue of musical performances, its margins scribbled with annotations in a hurried hand, and across 2 pages was a name he dreaded, Dorian Vecht. The annotations described Vecht's final symphony in reverent detail, but what made Elias's blood run cold were the sketches, crude drawings of instruments etched with the same sigils that marred the violin. Each sketch bore a title: the first violin, the cello, the horn, the piano, a full orchestra. Clara's voice wavered. If these instruments still exist, they might already be here, Elias interrupted, scanning the shadows. The lantern sputtered suddenly, plunging them into near darkness. Elias drew his revolver, the click echoing sharply. A figure stood at the far end of the aisle, tall and thin, watching. Its features were obscured, but Elias glimpsed pale hands poised as though conducting an invisible ensemble. The figure lifted one arm. Instantly, the lantern flame steadied, yet the shadows deepened, pressing close. The faint sound of a bow scraped across strings right behind them. Elias spun, but no one stood there. Only the shelves, the dust, and the echo of a note that had already finished playing. When he turned back, the figure was gone. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Elias shut the book and slipped it beneath his coat. "We're leaving," he said firmly, guiding Clara up the stairs. But as they emerged into the fog-drenched street, Elias realized with chilling certainty the library had not merely stored knowledge of the orchestra. It had housed one of its echoes, and now the music knew their names. By the time Elias Ward and Clara Holt emerged from the fog-swathed streets, the detective knew they needed more than scraps of history and broken instruments. They needed testimony. Records of Vecht's cursed performance spoke of 200 vanished souls, yet buried in one forgotten police report. Elias recalled a single improbable detail. One person had survived, an usher. Her name had been Rosa Kell, a young attendant working the aisles of the Grand Opera House that fateful night. Rumors claimed she had fled the city after endless questioning, her sanity fractured by what she had witnessed. Elias wasn't sure she was even still alive, but if she was, she might hold the key to understanding how the music devoured its audience. Clara followed close as Elias led her through crooked back streets to a derelict boarding house. On the city's south end, the building leaned against its neighbors like a drunk too stubborn to fall. Its windows boarded, paint flaking like diseased skin. Elias knocked once, then again. No answer. He tried the handle it gave reluctantly. Inside, the air was stale with mildew and dust. The narrow hallway groaned under their weight. At the far end, a door creaked open, and a figure emerged small, bent with age, her hair a tangle of gray wisps. Her eyes, though clouded, glittered with a sharpness that unsettled Elias. "I knew you would come," the woman croaked. Elias stiffened. "You're Rosakel?" She nodded slowly. "I've waited years for someone to ask about him again." "About Vetched." Clara's breath caught. "You were there when they vanished?" Rosa's hands trembled as she beckoned them inside her cluttered room. Dusty curtains blocked the moonlight, and the only illumination came from a single oil lamp flickering atop a desk crowded with yellowed papers. She sat heavily in a chair, staring into the flame. "The music," she whispered. It wasn't just sound. It filled the air like smoke, crawling into lungs, into the heart. People didn't scream. They didn't run. They listened. Her voice cracked. They listened until they were gone. Elias leaned forward. "Gone how?" Rosa's eyes flicked up, watery but fierce. The notes peeled them away. Skin, breath, memory layer by layer until there was nothing left. Only silence. And in that silence I heard him laughing. "Vetched," Elias said grimly. Rosa nodded. He wasn't just conducting music. He was conducting the city itself. And when the final note came, her voice broke into a wheeze. "I should have gone too, but the music rejected me. I don't know why." The room grew unbearably still. Elias exchanged a glance with Clara. If the cursed symphony had spared Rosa, it had done so for a reason. And perhaps Elias thought that reason was not mercy. Rosakel's hands shook as she reached for the collar of her threadbare shawl. With a slow, deliberate motion, she tugged the fabric aside, exposing the skin of her neck. Elias Ward leaned closer, and Clara drew in a sharp breath. There, etched faintly into Rosa's flesh, was a mark, not a scar of injury, but a pattern. Thin lines curved into loops and angles like the bars of a staff without notes. At its center, 4 dark slashes crossed, intersecting like a conductor's baton frozen midair. "This appeared the morning after the performance," Rosa whispered. "It burned like fire. I thought it was a curse, a punishment for surviving." Elias studied it with grim intensity. The lines were nearly identical to the sigils carved into the violin. This was no random scar. It was deliberate, an imprint of the music itself. "Others who were there," Rosa continued, "they were taken. But some only a few walked away like me. Each of us bore this mark, and one by one I heard they vanished in the years that followed. Some in their beds, some on the street. No blood, no struggle, only silence. Always silence." Clara shivered, hugging herself. "Then why are you still alive?" Rosa's cloudy eyes glistened. "Because I never listened again. I closed my ears to every note, every hum, every whisper of music. I live in silence. Even the sound of a kettle boiling makes me sick." Her voice cracked with sudden urgency. "You must burn that violin. Destroy it before it calls to the others, before the orchestra gathers again." Elias said nothing at first. He knew fire might consume the wood, but he doubted flame could erase whatever essence clung to the strings. If this mark is proof the music chooses its listeners, he murmured, then perhaps it leaves something else behind. A trail. Rosa's lips trembled. You cannot follow it. It leads only to him. But Elias's mind was already racing. A mark meant a connection, a tether between victim and conductor. If Rosa's body bore the echo of Vetch's music, then perhaps it could point them to where the next movement would rise. He rose, fastening his coat. Thank you, Rosa. You've told us more than you know. Her gaze hardened. You'll regret this. Vetch doesn't want to be found. He wants to be heard. As Elias and Clara stepped back into the fog, the night felt sharper, as though strings had been stretched taut across the city, waiting to be plucked. Elias touched the violin case under his arm, his jaw set. The orchestra was awakening. The fog that night was thicker than Elias Ward had ever known. It pressed close to the lamplight, swallowing the glow before it could reach the street. As he and Clara walked, the detective's thoughts circled around Rosa's warning. Burn the violin. Forget the music. Yet the fragment of sheet music in his pocket throbbed in his awareness like a pulse, and the sigils etched into Rosa's skin haunted his mind. If Vetch had forged an entire orchestra, then one violin was only the beginning. Elias needed confirmation, so he turned to an unlikely source, a pawnbroker named Kester Lane, whose cramped shop was notorious for trading in unusual relics. Some whispered to carry more curses than value. If any trace of Vetch's work had surfaced in the decades since the vanished audience, Kester would know. The shop reeked of varnish and damp velvet, shelves stacked with cracked instruments, tarnished candlesticks, and forgotten heirlooms. Kester himself was a stooped man with spectacles that magnified his watery eyes. He peered at Elias and Clara with suspicion. You're digging in places best left buried, Kester said before Elias had spoken a word. Elias set the violin case gently on the counter. Have you seen its kin? The pawnbroker flinched as though scorched. His eyes darted to the case, then away. For a long moment, silence pressed down, broken only by the ticking of a dusty wall clock. Finally, Kester leaned forward, voice dropping. There was a cello, he whispered. Came through my hands 5 years back. The wood was black as coal, strings stiff as bone. I wanted it gone the moment I touched it. Sold it cheap to a man who claimed he collected rare instruments. Who? Elias pressed. Kester's lips trembled. He called himself Dr. Harrow. A surgeon, I think. Lives near the old opera district. Clara paled. The same district where the audience vanished. Elias nodded grimly. The circle was tightening. Before leaving, he asked one final question. Did you hear it? Kester hesitated, then shuddered. Just one note when I tested the strings. It sounded like the floor splitting open beneath me. I didn't sleep for a week. Outside, the fog curled thick around them. Elias's hand brushed the violin case. If the cello still exists, he said quietly, then Vetch's orchestra is already reforming. Clara's voice trembled. And if this doctor plays it? Elias's gaze hardened. Then the city won't wake from the next performance. They turned toward the opera district. Somewhere ahead a cello waited, its strings ready to echo the dead. The closer Elias Ward and Clara Holt drew to the opera district, the more oppressive the fog became. buildings loomed like half-remembered giants, their facades crumbling under decades of neglect. It was a neighborhood where echoes lingered, where whispers of the vanished audience still clung to cracked cobblestones. Dr. Harrow's residence was not difficult to find. The house stood at the end of a narrow lane, its windows shuttered, its roofline crooked like a scowl. A brass plate by the door, tarnished green with age, bore the name Dr. Silas Harrow, physician and surgeon. No light spilled from within. Elias rapped twice, then waited. The silence was deep enough to sting. On the third knock, the door creaked open by itself. Inside, the house smelled of formaldehyde and dust. Jars of cloudy liquid lined shelves in the hall, floating specimens staring with lifeless eyes. Surgical instruments gleamed faintly from their cases, their edges too sharp, too eager. Clara clutched her shawl tighter, her discomfort plain. A voice drifted from deeper within the house. "Detective Ward, I wondered when you would arrive." Elias stiffened. He had not given his name. They followed the voice into a parlor lit by a single oil lamp. There, seated with eerie calm, was Dr. Harrow, a tall, gaunt man with hands that seemed too long, fingers twitching as though always dissecting some unseen form. Beside his chair rested a case of black oak, tall enough to cradle a cello. "You've brought the violin," Harrow said smoothly, eyes flicking to the case under Elias's arm. "How exquisite." The first voice has returned to the choir. Elias ignored the remark. "Where did you get the cello?" Harrow's smile thinned. "From a man who did not deserve it. Instruments such as these choose their keepers." Vetch knew that. He rose slowly, almost ceremonially, and placed a hand on the case beside him. "Would you like to hear it?" Clara shook her head sharply, but Elias's gaze did not waver. "Play it," he said. Harrow's smile widened as though he had been waiting for permission. He opened the case. The cello within gleamed unnaturally, its surface so dark it seemed to swallow the lamplight. Sigils etched its body in patterns that shifted subtly if stared at too long. When Harrow drew the bow across the strings, the note that emerged was not music. It was a groan, deep and cavernous, like the city itself crying out from beneath the earth. The floorboards trembled. Clara gasped, clapping her hands over her ears. Elias felt the sound pull at him, tugging his very thoughts into its resonance. He forced himself to focus, his jaw clenched. Harrow's eyes gleamed. "Do you hear it, detective? The orchestra stirs. Soon it will rise again." The room quivered under the weight of Dr. Harrow's cello, each bow stroke drawing, vibrations that pressed against the walls like invisible tides. Elias Ward's pulse matched the rhythm, every beat of his heart echoing in dissonance. Clara crouched near the doorway, trembling, her eyes wide with terror. Elias tightened his grip on the violin case. Against every instinct screaming to run, he set the box upon the table and opened it. The violin within gleamed faintly, as though eager, hungry. When he lifted it, the instrument felt warm, almost alive. Harrow's gaze sharpened, anticipation sharpening his features. "Yes," he whispered. "Play. Let it answer." Elias hesitated only a second before raising the bow. The violin's first note was a blade of sound, slicing clean through the cello's groaning foundation. The two instruments clashed warm, low, and cavernous. the other sharp and searing. Shadows stirred in the corners of the room, elongating and twisting as though responding to the duel. Clara gasped, covering her mouth as the wallpaper began to peel back in strips. Behind it lay not plaster, but darkness, an endless void stretching beyond sight. The house itself seemed to be folding into the music. Elias fought to control his playing, his fingers instinctively finding melodies he had never learned. The violin guided him, its strings resonating with eerie precision. Harrow's bow moved faster in response, the cello howling like a wounded beast, yet weaving threads of power through every note. Together the instruments formed a deuce that was not of this world. In that spiraling storm of sound, Elias glimpsed visions, a grand opera house filled with faceless patrons, their hands clapping in silence. A conductor at the podium, his baton moving with godlike control. An orchestra of pale, skeletal musicians, their bodies long dead, but their instruments still alive. The music threatened to drown Elias. His breath came ragged, sweat dripping down his temple. Yet he pushed harder, his violin's shrill cry rising above Harrow's thunder. For a brief moment the void in the walls shuddered and closed. Harrow stumbled, his bow faltering, his face twisted in frustration. "You dare defy the harmony?" Elias lowered his bow, chest heaving. "If this is harmony, it belongs in hell." The cello shrieked one final note, loud enough to rattle the jars in the hallway. Then Harrow stopped, his expression shifting from fury to amusement. He closed the cello case with deliberate care. "This was but a prelude," he said softly, his smile unnerving in its calm. "The true performance approaches." And detective, his eyes gleamed, "you are already part of the orchestra." The lamp flickered violently, then died, plunging the house into blackness. When Elias Ward stepped back into the night, the fog of the opera district clung to him like damp wool. Clara hurried at his side, her breaths quick and shallow, as if she feared the music would follow them out of Harrow's cursed house. Yet even in the open air the memory of the duet lingered, vibrating in Elias's bones. The streets were nearly deserted. Gas lamps flickered weakly, their flames warped as though bent by unseen drafts. Elias paused, listening. The fog was not silent, it hummed. Beneath the rustle of distant carriages and the faint creak of wood, there was a murmur, a resonance, notes faint and indistinct, but undeniably music. Clara noticed his stillness. "Do you hear it?" She whispered. He nodded grimly. "The city is echoing?" As they walked, every corner seemed to hold its own refrain. A low hum near a boarded apothecary, a high, keening whistle by the iron gates of a park, even the uneven rhythm of water dripping from a broken gutter seemed to fall into some grander, hidden score. Elias thought of Harrow's words, "The orchestra stirs." Could it be that the city itself was an instrument? That every brick, every pipe, every hollow alley was part of the cursed composition? They reached a bridge spanning the sluggish river. Here the sound grew stronger. Elias leaned on the rail, gazing down. The water moved strangely, not with the natural eddies of current, but in synchronized ripples, as if responding to a beat inaudible to the human ear. Clara clutched his sleeve. "It's everywhere, Elias. We can't escape it." He looked at her, and for the first time he saw genuine fear break her composure. Clara Holt, the unshakable archivist, whose hands did not tremble, even when rifling through coffins of forgotten history, now stood pale and small in the presence of something vast. Elias placed his hand over hers. If it's everywhere, then we'll follow it. The music leaves a trail, and trails can be traced. Before she could respond, a figure emerged at the far end of the bridge. A man, tall and thin, his face hidden beneath a bowler hat. He walked with a deliberate rhythm, each footstep striking the stone in perfect tempo. Elias's stomach clenched. This was no casual passer-by. The figure paused halfway across, head tilting as though listening to a conductor only he could hear. Then, without a word, he lifted his hand and made a sharp downward motion. From somewhere in the fog, a violin string snapped with a violent twang. The sound reverberated through the night like a gunshot. Clara gasped. Elias's pulse thundered. The man in the bowler hat lowered his hand slowly, almost reverently, then vanished into the mist. Elias Ward and Clara Holt stood frozen on the bridge, staring into the fog where the man in the bowler hat had disappeared. The river below lapped quietly at its banks, yet the echo of that snapped string still vibrated in the air, like the aftertaste of a bitter medicine. Clara's grip on Elias's sleeve tightened. He wasn't normal, she whispered. Elias nodded. No, every step he took matched a tempo. It was as if he was moving to music we couldn't hear. They lingered for a moment longer before Elias guided her away from the bridge. The city streets beyond seemed quieter now, as though even the fog itself held its breath. They returned to Elias's modest office near the edge of the old quarter. Once inside, Clara sank into a chair, exhaustion written in every line of her face. Elias moved to the desk, pulling out a stack of newspaper clippings he had collected about the disappearances. He spread them before her. Do you notice something strange? Clara scanned them quickly, her sharp mind cutting through the words. They all happened on nights when someone reported hearing the melody. Elias tapped one clipping with a calloused finger, and here the disappearance of a violinist from the conservatory. No body, no signs of struggle. Just gone. Clara frowned. You think the man on the bridge was connected? I think he was keeping time, Elias said quietly, like a metronome guiding the city into the composition. Before Clara could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Elias's hand went to the pistol hidden in his drawer, but when he opened the door, no one stood there. Only a folded sheet of paper rested on the floor. He retrieved it cautiously and unfolded it. Inside was a piece of music notation scrawled by hand, yet precise. The title read, Adagio of the Bowler Hat. Beneath it, a short phrase, Every city has its conductor. Clara's face paled as she traced the notes. This isn't just music, it's instruction. Each measure aligns with a district of the city. It's mapping something. Elias studied the paper, his jaw tightening. If he's the conductor, then the people aren't just vanishing. They're being arranged. The thought struck them both with chilling clarity. The disappearances weren't random. They were notes in a living symphony. Clara shivered. If that's true, Elias, then we're not fighting a man. We're fighting an orchestra that's already begun. The oil lamp sputtered, its flame bending as if bowing to an unseen baton. The sheet of music lay between Elias Ward and Clara Holt, like a puzzle from another world. Its notes curved across the staves in peculiar patterns. Some stretched unnaturally long, others bunched together as if impatient. At first glance it looked like ordinary composition, but Elias knew better nothing about this cursed orchestra was ordinary. Clara leaned closer, adjusting her spectacles. "Look here," she murmured, tracing a finger along the measures. "Each bar isn't just rhythm. It corresponds to a block of the city." Iles frowned, following her finger. The first cluster of notes aligned perfectly with the district, near the opera house, the very place where the first vanishings occurred. The second phrase mapped onto the bridge, where the man in the bowler hat had appeared, and further still, new clusters stretched into neighborhoods yet untouched. "They're building it piece by piece," Elias said grimly. "Every disappearance is a note, every location a measure." Clara's lips tightened, which means the city itself is becoming a score. The weight of the idea pressed against Elias's chest. If true, then every alley, every brick, every heartbeat in this city could be absorbed into the music. He thought back to the ripples on the river, the hum and the fog. The city was no longer resisting, it was participating. Suddenly Clara stiffened. "Look at this marking." She pointed to a strange symbol near the end of the composition. It was neither a musical note nor a rest, but an elaborate flourish resembling a conductor's baton. "I've seen this before in the archives. It's fetched seal." Elias's jaw clenched. "Then this isn't just Harrow's doing. The composer himself vetched is guiding all of this." Clara's eyes narrowed as she pieced it together. If this composition continues, it will culminate in a grand performance. Not in a single hall, but across the entire city. A symphony made of stone, steel, and blood. The idea chilled them both. Elias shoved the paper into a folder and slammed it shut. "Then we find the next note before it's played." As if in answer, the street outside erupted with sound first, a single low hum, then dozens of voices humming in unison. Elias and Clara rushed to the window. Down below, townsfolk wandered in the fog, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused. Each one moved with mechanical precision, stepping in rhythm, mouths shaping the same wordless tone. The music sheet in Elias's hand vibrated as though alive. Clara whispered, horrified, "The city isn't just the score. The people are instruments, too." Elias felt a cold certainty tighten in his gut. If they didn't stop the conductor soon, the city would be nothing more than an orchestra pit. Every life a note waiting to be played. The street outside Elias Ward's office looked like a stage overtaken by a nightmare. Dozens of townsfolk drifted through the fog, their footsteps synchronized, their eyes glazed as if sleepwalking. Their lips moved, forming a droning hum that blended into a single chord. Clara gripped Elias's arm tightly. "They're singing without words, like a choir stripped of meaning." Elias studied the procession, his stomach churning. These were bakers, clerks, children, ordinary citizens who had gone missing from the reports. Now they moved like puppets, part of something larger. Every step landed in rhythm, every note carried weight. They weren't wandering aimlessly. They were rehearsing. One figure at the front drew Elias's attention. A woman in a tattered evening gown, the fabric still glittering faintly with sequins. She walked with eerie grace, her arms swaying as though still on stage. Clara gasped softly. "That's Helena Durrett," she whispered. the prima soprano who vanished from the Royal Opera. Elias felt his throat tighten. He had read her name in the clippings. One of the first disappearances after the cursed melody began to spread. Now here she was, her once golden voice reduced to a hollow drone, lost in the choir of the damned. The hum deepened. Elias realized with horror that it wasn't random. It was harmonizing with the city itself. The sound bounced off stone, rolled along iron gutters, even seemed to ripple through the lamplight. The fog amplified it, carrying the vibration down every street. Clara clutched the music sheet tighter. Elias, this section. Look. She pointed to the measures that mapped onto their current district. The notes aligned perfectly with the tones the choir was producing. They're rehearsing this movement, Elias muttered. His pulse quickened, which means when the conductor arrives, they'll be ready for the performance. As if summoned by his words, the man in the bowler hat emerged from the mist at the far end of the street. He raised his hand, and instantly the choir fell silent. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the humming, a suffocating vacuum. Then, with a subtle flick of his wrist, he set them moving again, this time in counterpoint, their voices layering like a cathedral of echoes. Clara's eyes brimmed with dread. He's shaping them, guiding them. Elias tightened his grip on the violin case slung over his shoulder. His instincts screamed to confront the figure, but the sheer scale of what he was hearing held him back. The bowler hat man was not merely conducting the choir. He was bending reality itself, turning people into living notes. Elias whispered, almost to himself, if he can conduct the lost, what will happen when he commands the entire city? The fog swallowed the procession again, leaving behind only silence, and the faint vibration of walls still resonating with their song. The following morning, Elias Ward and Clara Holt returned to the archives, their eyes heavy with sleeplessness. The memory of the choir's hollow voices clung to them like smoke. Clara wasted no time, guiding Elias through rows of dust-laden shelves until they reached a locked cabinet she had only whispered about before. This is the restricted section, she said, producing a small brass key from her necklace. I wasn't certain it would still be here, but if Vetch left writings behind, this is where they'd be. The lock groaned open. Inside lay a single leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, its edges frayed like burnt paper. On the spine, almost rubbed away, were the words Aurelian Vetch Notes on the Grand Work. Elias lifted it carefully. The book felt unnaturally heavy, as if the ink itself carried more than words. They settled at a long oak table, and Clara opened it to the first page. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, every letter precise, as though written to a rhythm. The opening entry chilled them immediately. Music is not art, it is architecture for the soul. Stone crumbles, flesh rots, but sound is eternal. My orchestra will be the bones upon which eternity rests. Clara's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Diagrams filled the margin, streets drawn as staves, buildings as notes, rivers as flowing measures of time. Vetch had not only imagined this city as an instrument, he had designed it that way from the beginning. Elias leaned closer, his jaw tightening. This wasn't an accident. This city was built for his music. Further in, the journal grew darker. One passage read, "Instruments must be alive." Their bodies carry resonance that wood alone cannot achieve. The human voice is the purest vessel, but strings and bones together, ah, that is perfection. Clara shut the book abruptly, bile rising in her throat. He used people, not just as singers, but as material for his instruments. Ilias's mind raced. That explained the sigils carved into the violin and cello, their unnatural warmth. The way they guided his fingers. They weren't instruments at all. They were vessels of souls trapped in resonance. At the final section, an unfinished score sprawled across several pages. Above it, Vetch had scrawled a single phrase, the grand crescendo 40 voices, one city, eternal silence. Clara's voice shook as she whispered, 40 parts. He wrote the end before it began. Elias closed the journal with a snap, his expression grim. Then we know where this is headed, and if we don't stop it, this city won't just fall silent, it will become his symphony forever. The lamplight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to sway like boughs over unseen strings. The journal's revelations left Elias Ward shaken, but it was the violin at his side that weighed on him most heavily. The more he played it, the more he sensed it wasn't merely a tool, it was something alive, listening, waiting. Clara Holt saw it, too. Each time Elias touched the strings, her eyes flickered with unease, as though she feared he might vanish into its resonance. That evening, Elias returned alone to his office. Clara had insisted on researching more of Vetch's architectural plans, but Elias needed solitude for what he intended. He set the violin on the desk, its polished surface catching the lamplight like a dark jewel. For a long moment he simply stared at it. Then, carefully, he tightened the bow and drew it across the strings. The note that emerged was not sound, it was a whisper. Elias froze, his skin prickling. He played again, slower. This time the violin spoke more clearly. The voice was faint, ethereal, but undeniably human. "Help me." Elias's breath caught. He lowered the instrument, his heart hammering. Could it be true? He steadied his hand and played another phrase. Again the whisper rose, woven into the vibration of the string. "My name, Helena." Elias's mind reeled. Helena Durot, the prima soprano who had walked in the choir of the lost. He had seen her, hollow-eyed, drifting like the others, and yet her soul, her voice was trapped inside this violin. The bow trembled in his hand. "You're alive?" He whispered aloud. The strings vibrated in answer. Bound, he took. My voice split me. Body in the choir, soul in the string. Elias felt the weight of her suffering press against him. Vetch's cruelty had gone beyond death. He had divided people, scattering their essence into instruments while their shells wandered in servitude. "What do you want me to do?" Elias asked, his throat dry. The whisper rose in a trembling harmony. "Play, finish. Release." The final note quivered until silence claimed the room. Elias lowered the violin, sweat beading his brow. He understood now each cursed instrument carried a prisoner, severed from themselves. To play them was not merely to summon music, but to awaken a voice crying for freedom. Clara returned not long after, her arms full of maps. She stopped short when she saw Elias's pale face. What happened? He met her gaze, the violin still in his hand. "It's not just an instrument, Clara. It's her. Helena Durot. She's inside this violin. Clara's lips parted in horror. Then Vetch didn't just write a symphony. He built an orchestra of souls. The revelation of Helena's soul inside the violin clung to Elias Ward like a curse. All night he paced his office, the instrument resting on his desk, its strings humming faintly even when untouched. Clara Holt spread her maps across the floor, candlelight dancing over inked lines that now looked less like streets and more like staves of a massive score. "We were wrong," Clara said at last, her voice brittle with dread. "The vanishings weren't just abductions. Vetch split them, bodies into the choir, souls into the instruments. Two halves of the same person forever divided." Elias stared at the violin. The image of Helena's blank, humming body marching in the choir returned to him. Now he understood why her voice inside the violin had begged for release. She was fractured, torn between two prisons. Clara flipped through the journal again, her finger landing on a passage, scrawled in Vetch's harsh hand. "Harmony requires dissonance. Divide the whole to strengthen the sum. The choir provides breath, the instrument's voice. Together, eternity." Her lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't just conducting. He was rebuilding humanity into his orchestra. A sudden noise outside drew their attention, a low, mournful hum rising from the street. Elias rushed to the window. Below, the choir of the lost drifted once more through the fog, their steps perfectly aligned. Tonight, though, their song was different. It was slower, deeper, almost sorrowful, the kind of lament sung for the dead. Elias recognized fragments of the melody Helena had whispered through the violin. Clara joined him at the glass, her eyes glistening. "They're crying for what they've lost, for what they've become." Elias's chest ached. Every note carried pain of being incomplete, pain of being trapped. He realized with horror that the choir wasn't willingly serving the conductor. They were prisoners forced into performance, their bodies instruments of rhythm while their voices languished in wood and string. The man in the bowler hat appeared again at the head of the procession. He raised his hand, and instantly the lament shifted into something sharper, more structured. Their sorrow became fuel for his control. Clara gripped Elias's arm. "If Helena is in the violin, how many more are in the others?" Elias's jaw tightened. "Every missing person. Every cursed instrument we've seen, the cello, the flute, the ones yet to come. Each one is a soul crying to be freed." As the choir's lament faded into the fog, Elias made a silent vow. He would not only stop the conductor, he would find a way to free those trapped voices, even if it meant playing the final note himself. The following day, Clara Holt led Elias Ward through the city's forgotten quarter, where brick walls sagged under ivy and windows had been bricked up decades ago. Their destination was a place Clara spoke of in hushed tones, the Library of Silence. It had once been a private collection for composers and scholars of the occult arts of sound. Few remembered it existed, fewer still dared to enter. The building was squat and unwelcoming, its doorway marked by cracked columns and an iron door that groaned open reluctantly. Inside, the air smelled of mold and ash. Dust motes hung thick in the gloom, drifting like ash in dying lamplight. "Here," Clara whispered, leading him past collapsed shelves until they reached a chamber hidden behind velvet curtains. On a pedestal lay a stack of manuscripts bound in cracked leather. Across the first cover, written in a careful, almost reverent hand, was a single word, binding. Elias brushed the dust away and opened it. His stomach knotted. The pages inside weren't ordinary notation, they were diagrams of human anatomy, laid across musical staves. Veins aligned with strings, lungs with organ pipes, bones mapped into percussion. Each drawing showed how sound could be anchored into flesh. Clara read aloud from the margin. The body is rhythm. The soul is resonance. Sever the two, and you may graft resonance into wood, brass, or string. Thus a voice eternal, an instrument alive. Elias closed the manuscript quickly, bile rising in his throat. He turned surgery into composition. They sifted through more texts, each worse than the last. One detailed how to extract a single vocal tone from a person, leaving their body mute but their essence trapped in a flute. Another described harvesting rhythm from a dancer's heartbeat, to be sealed within a drum. Clara's voice trembled as she read, "The instruments are prisons, the choir are shells." He created a cycle of suffering, all in service of his grand crescendo. At the final manuscript, Elias found something different. Instead of diagrams, it contained rituals ways to unbind. The text was incomplete, scratched out in places, but a passage caught his eye. To free a voice, the instrument must be played not in harmony, but in defiance. Strike discord against the conductor's will, and the bond may shatter. Elias looked at the violin on his back. Helena's whisper echoed in his memory, "Play, release." Before he could speak, a sound stirred within the library, a soft scraping like bow against string, though no one else was present. The shadows between the shelves shifted. Elias and Clara stiffened as a figure emerged, tall, robed, its face hidden beneath a mask shaped like a conductor's baton. The silence of the library broke, filled instead with the dreadful hum of strings tuning themselves in the dark. The robed figure advanced slowly, the mask gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It wasn't porcelain or metal, but carved wood, shaped into a smooth oval with a single vertical slash, as if mimicking the baton stroke of a conductor. Its presence carried weight, as though the room itself leaned toward it in obedience. Elias instinctively stepped in front of Clara, hand brushing the violin strapped to his shoulder. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his voice came out hushed. Like the library itself swallowed his words. The figure didn't answer in speech. Instead, it raised its arm, and from somewhere in the stacks, books shifted, pages fluttering open. The sound built into a strange rhythm paper, rustling like percussion, spines creaking like bass notes. The very library had become an orchestra pit, with the masked figure as its silent conductor. Clara's grip tightened on her satchel. "It's not a person. It's a guardian, a keeper bound to this place." The librarian moved its hand, and the rustling swelled into a low drone. Elias felt pressure building in his chest, his own heartbeat sinking against his will with the rhythm of the fluttering pages. It was the same kind of pull he'd felt from the choir outside, but sharper, more invasive. With effort, he tore the violin free. The strings vibrated beneath his fingertips, eager, almost alive. He remembered the passage from the manuscript, "Strike discord," against the conductor's will. He lifted the bow and drew it roughly across the strings. The sound was raw, jagged, nothing resembling melody. But the effect was immediate. The rhythm faltered. Pages froze mid-rustle. The drone broke into scattered echoes. The librarian's masked head tilted, as though registering pain. Clara seized the moment. She hurled a lantern at the shelves beside them. Glass shattered, flames licking across brittle paper. Smoke filled the chamber, curling in thick spirals. The librarian recoiled, retreating into shadow as the fire consumed the lower shelves. Yet its presence lingered, a warning more than a defeat. Through the haze, its masked face leaned forward one last time, the vertical slash glowing faintly like a burning baton. Then it vanished into the smoke. Coughing, Clara grabbed Elias's arm. "We have to go now." They fled into the night air, the library collapsing behind them in fire and ash. Yet Elias could not shake the image of that mask, nor the certainty that the guardian was not destroyed, only dismissed. And worse, the words echoed in his head, "The librarian keeps what the conductor wants hidden." What secrets had they destroyed in the fire? And what had the librarian carried away into the dark? The fire's glow still burned on the horizon when Elias and Clara reached the safety of a narrow alley. Both were smeared with soot, their lungs raw from smoke. They leaned against a damp brick wall, gasping for breath as the last echoes of collapsing shelves thundered behind them. Clara wiped her brow with the back of her hand. Centuries of knowledge gone, and we barely know what we lost. Her voice cracked, a mix of despair and fury. Elias pulled the violin case closer, hands trembling as he unlatched it. The instrument seemed untouched, though faint wisps of smoke still curled from its strings. When his fingers brushed the wood, Helena's whisper trembled faintly inside. "Hurry, hurry before it's all erased." He stiffened, erased, not just destroyed. The librarian hadn't only been guarding manuscripts, it had been erasing them, silencing truth vetched, wanted hidden. The fire may have aided that work. "We didn't lose everything," Elias said finally. He dug into his coat pocket and produced a charred scrap of parchment he'd grabbed in the chaos. The edges were blackened, the ink smudged, but a few words remained legible. Resonance stone. Anchor of division located beneath. The last lines had burned away. Clara leaned closer, eyes wide. Resonance stone? That sounds like a focal point. If Vetch divided souls into instruments, he needed something to stabilize the fracture. That stone must be it. Elias folded the scrap carefully, as if it were gold. Then if we find it, we may find a way to undo him. Before Clara could reply, the faint strains of a melody drifted down the alley. Both froze. It was not the sorrowful hum of the choir, but a sharper sound like a flute played by an unseen hand. The notes cut through the fog, commanding, searching. Elias's instincts screamed. He grabbed Clara's wrist, pulling her deeper into the shadows as the sound grew louder. At the far end of the alley, a figure appeared, a tall man in a gray coat, carrying a silver flute. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, his movements eerily mechanical. The instrument played without breath, as though it itself commanded him. Clara's whisper was barely audible. Another prisoned soul. Another piece of the orchestra. The flutist paused, head tilting, as if sniffing out their presence. The melody sharpened, dissonant notes scattering like hunting dogs. Elias tightened his grip on the violin. This was no random encounter. The conductor's reach had found them again, weaving his orchestra tighter around their every step. And somewhere beneath the city, the resonant stone waited, pulsing like the heart of the nightmare. The first piercing notes of the flute sliced through the fog like razors. Elias felt the sound reverberate in his bones, not as melody but as command. The flutist's eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, unfocused yet unyielding, as though the instrument itself had hollowed out his humanity and filled the void with music. "Run," Elias whispered, shoving Clara forward. They darted down the twisting alley, their footsteps muffled by damp stone. Yet the flute followed, weaving notes that clung to the air, twisting the streets into a labyrinth. Every corner seemed wrong. Every turn led them back to fog-choked passages they thought they had left behind. "It's controlling the streets," Clara gasped, her voice ragged. "The music, it's reshaping the city around us." Elias yanked the violin free, bow trembling in his hand. "Then we reshape it back." He dragged the bow harshly across the strings. Discord shrieked into the night, a sound that set teeth on edge. The flute faltered for a moment, its notes cracking before regaining their force. Clara pointed. "That broke his rhythm, do it again." The chase spilled into a deserted square, the gas lamps long extinguished. The flutist stepped into view from the fog, his movements stiff, puppet-like. His silver instrument gleamed as he lifted it again. The first notes coiled upward, and instantly Elias felt his knees weaken, his body wanting to kneel, to submit. "No," he growled through clenched teeth, forcing himself upright. He slashed the bow across the violin strings in a clashing counterpoint. The sound was ugly, but it split the air, disrupting the invisible grip of the flute. Clara seized the chance, grabbing a loose brick from the square and hurling it at the cobblestones. In front of the flutist, the crash shattered the silence, and the man paused, head twitching. For a brief moment his glassy eyes flickered with something human. His lips parted as though to speak, but the flute seized control again, forcing another anguished note from him. "Help me." The word slipped out, fragile, nearly lost under the rising tune. Elias's heart clenched. This wasn't just an enemy. It was another captive, another soul chained into wood and breath. But there was no time for mercy. The melody surged again, stronger than before, whipping the fog into tendrils that reached for them like grasping hands. "Elias," Clara cried. He raised the violin, knowing the only way to survive was to pit Helena's imprisoned soul against the tortured one inside the flute. And in the clash of their discord, perhaps a fragment of freedom could be born. The square became a stage. Fog curled into curtains, the stones beneath their feet humming, faintly as though the city itself braced for performance. Elias lifted the violin, his bow quivering but ready. Across from him, the flutist raised his silver instrument, eyes vacant but burning with unnatural light. The first note of the flute pierced the air shrill, commanding, unnatural. It cut straight through Elias's chest, forcing his breath shallow, his heart stumbling against its rhythm. The cobblestones around his boots cracked faintly, as if even the ground answered to the flute's call. Elias gritted his teeth and struck back, dragging the bow across Helena's strings. A raw, discordant wail split the night, jagged as broken glass. For an instant the fog recoiled, twisting violently. The square shook as the two sounds collided, invisible waves smashing into one another like storm-tossed seas. Clara clutched her satchel to her chest, ducking behind a lamp-post. Her eyes darted between them. "You're tearing the air apart. Hold your ground, Elias." The flutist stepped forward, his melody shifting. It became hypnotic, weaving notes that pressed against Elias's mind like icy fingers. Images flashed unbidden, dark corridors, rows of silent faces. The conductor's baton slicing through the void. The temptation to lower his bow, to submit, gnawed at him. Then, through the violin, Helena's whisper stirred. Fight. Discord, not harmony. Elias obeyed. He scraped the bow at an angle, forcing the violin into a screech that shattered the flute's rhythm. The flutist staggered, hands trembling as though the instrument resisted him. For a heartbeat, his glassy eyes cleared, wide with terror. "Stop it, please." But the flute seized him again, ripping the cry away and replacing it. With a shriek of notes so sharp the lamp-posts shivered and cracked, Elias lunged into the sound, bow moving furiously. Every note he drew was ugly, clashing, raw defiance. The violin trembled with Helena's voice, each scream of discord ripping into the flute's melody. The clash built into a storm. Windows shattered. Stones lifted and fell. The fog writhed as though alive. Finally, with a deafening crack, one of the flute's silver seams split. The flutist screamed not of malice, but of agony and release as the instrument's control faltered. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the broken flute. The last note sputtered and died, leaving only silence ringing in the ruined square. Elias lowered the violin, his chest heaving. Clara rushed to his side, eyes wide. "Did you win?" The flutist looked up at them, tears streaking his ash-pale face. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Free me before he takes me again." The square lay in ruins, shattered windows, cracked stones, fog drifting like smoke after a battle. Elias knelt beside the flutist, whose trembling hands clutched the fractured silver instrument. The once glassy eyes now flickered with pain, humanity struggling to resurface. Clara crouched close, keeping her voice gentle. "What's your name?" The man swallowed hard, his voice rasping as though unused for years. Jonas Ellery." He coughed violently, each breath catching like a broken reed. "I was a musician, first chair in the city symphony, until he found me." Elias's eyes dropped to the flute. Even cracked, it pulsed faintly, as if a heartbeat lingered within. When his fingers brushed its cool surface, he felt it anguish, sharp and pleading, trapped inside the metal. Another soul, divided. "Did he put you in there?" Elias asked. Jonas shook his head weakly. "Not me. The flute. It holds another. A singer. A girl with a voice brighter than bells. He bound her inside, and used me as the vessel to carry her." His hands tightened on the instrument. Every note I played wasn't mine. It was hers, screaming through me. Clara's face paled. "So the conductor isn't just imprisoning souls in instruments. He's chaining people to the instruments that hold them." body and voice forced together in torment. Jonas's tears streaked his soot-stained face. When you broke it, I felt her weaken. She's fading, please. Don't let her vanish. Free her before he takes her completely. Elias studied the flute. The crack along its length oozed a faint shimmer, like light trying to escape. He remembered the manuscript. Strike discord against the conductor's will, and the bond may shatter. But this time shattering could mean destroying what remained of the soul inside. Helena's whisper trembled from the violin. Careful. Discord frees, but too much destroys. Clara pressed Elias's shoulder. We need to find the resonance stone. Maybe it's the only thing that can truly separate them without loss. Jonas gripped Elias's sleeve, desperation blazing in his hollow eyes. Promise me. Promise you won't let her die in silence. His words broke into another fit of coughing, his body too frail to withstand more. Elias met Clara's gaze, the weight of the vow settling like lead. We'll free her. Both of them. Him and every voice he's stolen. But even as he spoke, he felt the chill in the air shift. The fog thickened, pressing closer, as though the conductor himself had been listening all along. The conductor stood motionless, his silhouette framed by the swirling fog. His baton hovered in the air, gleaming faintly as though lit from within. When it fell, the choir's voices surged higher, swelling into a sound so vast it seemed to bend the very stones beneath Elias's feet. Clara doubled over, clutching her temples. He's inside my head, she gasped, her words nearly lost in the tide of harmony. Jonas writhed on the ground, the broken flute in his lap, glowing faintly as if the conductor were tugging at its essence, trying to reclaim what had been lost. Elias raised the violin, forcing his arms steady. The hum gnawed at his will, demanding obedience. His knees buckled, but he fought to remain upright. Helena's voice hissed through the strings. Strike him. Not with beauty, strike with defiance. The bow scraped across the strings, unleashing a snarl of discord. The sound slashed into the choir's harmony, jagged and raw. For a brief instant, the perfect order fractured. Several of the hollow-faced singers faltered, their voices warping into cries of pain. The conductor tilted his head, the motion precise, disdainful. He flicked the baton once. Instantly, the harmony corrected, swelling louder, crushing Elias's discord beneath its weight. The force of it drove him back a step, nearly tearing the violin from his grip. Clara shouted through the cacophony, "You can't overpower him, break his rhythm." Elias's mind raced. Rhythm. He remembered the manuscripts, the binding rituals that mapped body to beat, soul to resonance. The conductor wasn't just leading them, he was syncing them. Every voice locked to the tempo of his baton. He shifted his bowing, no longer dragging in long defiant wails, but striking sharp. Irregular bursts off beats, stutters, ruptures in time. The discord shattered against the harmony like stones against glass. The choir staggered, their perfect unity faltering as some voices broke free for a breath, screaming out in anguish. The conductor froze, baton still raised. For the first time the humming mass wavered. The air thickened, heavy with tension, as though the entire city paused on a single suspended note. Then the baton fell again. A wave of sound slammed into Elias, a force like a tidal surge. He was hurled to his knees. The violin clutched to his chest, his ears ringing with agony. Through the roar, he glimpsed the conductor's shadowed face tilt slightly, acknowledging him, not as a nuisance, but as a rival. Helena's whisper grew fierce. "He knows you now. He will not stop." Elias forced himself to his feet, blood trickling from his nose, bow trembling in his hand. Across the square, the conductor lowered his baton slowly, like an executioner savoring the moment. The battle had only begun. The choir's harmony swelled again, a tidal roar of voices that pressed against every stone, every breath. Elias staggered back, bow shaking in his hand. Clara clung to his sleeve, her face pale, blood trickling from her ear. Jonas lay crumpled nearby, twitching with every pulse of sound. The fractured flute glowing faintly, as if it still served the conductor's will. The violin against Elias's chest vibrated violently. Helena's voice rising within the strings. "Break him, or he breaks us." Elias pressed the bow down, forcing a scream from the instrument discord sharp enough to split glass. Windows exploded in showers of shards, the square echoing with splinters of sound. For a heartbeat, the choir faltered, their perfect pitch wrenched out of alignment. The conductor responded with a flick of his baton. The faltering singers stiffened. Their voices snapped back into formation. But Elias noticed its hesitation, a fracture in the perfect control. Clara's eyes widened. "You hurt him." The violins cutting through, but Helena's whisper trembled with warning. "Each strike weakens me. The strings cannot hold forever." Elias glanced at the violin. The wood along its body had begun to crack faintly, hairline fractures glowing with a dim, sorrowful light. Every discord he forced through it pushed Helena closer to breaking. The conductor raised his baton again. This time the choir split into sections, voices rising and falling in complex layers, a symphony of oppression. The air itself bent, compressing around Elias's lungs, forcing the breath from him. Clara dropped to her knees, gasping, hands clawing at her throat as if drowning in invisible waters. Elias fought to stand, bow poised. If he struck again with all his strength, he might tear through the conductor's grip. But the violin, Helena, it would not survive. Through the crushing harmony, Jonas's voice rasped weakly from the ground. "Not. Just you. Play with me." His trembling hands lifted the broken flute, its glow faint but defiant. "Let her voice join yours." Elias met his eyes. Broken vessel though he was, Jonas still had fight left. The conductor's baton hovered, ready to fall. Elias drew a deep breath, raised the bow, and nodded. "Together, then." As the baton slashed downward, Elias struck a raw chord and Jonas forced breath through the fractured flute. The clash of violin and flute screamed into the night not harmony, but jagged, wild defiance. The choir convulsed, voices tearing free in shrieks of agony. The fog writhed violently, recoiling as cracks of light split the darkness. The conductor staggered, his shadowed form flickering as though the sound itself wounded him. For the first time Elias saw him falter. The square convulsed with noise. Elias's violin screamed in raw defiance. Jonas's fractured flute shrieked in tortured bursts, and together their discord carved cracks through the conductor's perfect harmony. The fog reeled, collapsing in on itself, as if the city's very breath had been knocked from its chest. The conductor staggered back a step, his baton twitching in midair. His choir faltered, voices breaking into painful cries instead of notes. Several collapsed outright, clutching their throats as though awakening to the horror of their own captivity. Clara pressed against the cobblestones, shielding her head. Through the chaos, she shouted, "You're forcing him to lose control. Don't stop." Alias's arm burned with exhaustion, every stroke across the strings threatening to splinter the violin further. The cracks in its body spread, glowing faintly like veins of fire. Helena's whisper came ragged, desperate. "I can't hold much longer." Across from him the conductor straightened, though his shadowed face revealed nothing. Elias felt the weight of his gaze cold, calculating but not defeated. With a slow, deliberate gesture, the baton cut through the air. Instantly, the choir fell silent. The fog stilled. The entire square hushed, as if the sound itself had been cancelled. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the noise. The conductor lowered his baton, his silhouette razor-straight in the mist. When he spoke, it was not with a human voice, but with the resonance of many, like an entire audience whispering in unison. "You play at rebellion, Elias Ward, but discord cannot stand against eternity. Every note you strike shatters your own instrument. When the strings snap, so will you." Helena whimpered through the violin, her essence flickering with the warning. The conductor stepped backward into the fog. His form began to dissolve, scattering into mist, though the baton's faint glow lingered like an ember in the dark. His final words carried on the still air. "The resonance stone awaits beneath the old halls. Seek it, and you will find not freedom, but the end of your song." Then he was gone. The fog thinned, retreating into the alleys as though ashamed. The choir dispersed like marionettes with cut strings, their hollow bodies stumbling into the dark. Silence reclaimed the square at last. Elias fell to his knees, clutching the violin, chest heaving. Clara rushed to his side, her eyes bright with both fear and resolve. "He knows you now, and he's daring us to follow." Jonas coughed weakly, lifting the broken flute. "Then we don't have a choice. If the stone holds the key, we have to face it, before he commands the city forever." The square lay in ruins. Shards of glass from broken windows glistened like frozen tears on the cobblestones. The benches where the choir once stood were splintered, and the air still hummed, faintly as if reluctant to forget the conductor's presence. Elias sat slumped, bow across his knees, his violin trembling faintly in his hands. Clara crouched beside him, her face pale but determined. "He left us a clue. That wasn't just a threat, it was a challenge." Elias brushed his thumb across the fractured body of the violin. Helena's whisper was faint, fragile, the stone. Under the old halls, Jonas leaned heavily against a shattered lamppost, one arm clutched to his ribs. He wheezed but managed a grim smile. "Old halls. He means the conservatory, the place that burned down decades ago. The fire left nothing but ash and stone. But if anything was hidden beneath," Clara's gaze sharpened, "then that's where he's drawing his power from. The resonant stone must be buried there." A cold wind moved through the ruins, stirring ash and scraps of charred paper left from some long-forgotten night. Elias noticed one fragment drifting at his feet. He picked it up. The blackened paper bore faint lines of music, warped by fire. But as he turned it under the moonlight, symbols emerged small, precise notations drawn between the staves. Helena gasped through the violin's strings. A map concealed in the score. Clara leaned over, eyes wide. Look, these marks, they trace the layout of the conservatory's foundation. See this curve? That's the old amphitheater. And here, she tapped the paper, a passage beneath. Jonas hobbled closer, wincing. Hidden catacombs. Of course, the stone wouldn't just be left in open air. It's protected, buried where only sound could reveal it. The paper quivered in Elias's grip, resonating faintly with Helena's presence. He felt the tug of something deeper, an invitation, or a warning. The stone was calling, faint but relentless. But the conductor's voice still lingered in his memory, cold and mocking. Seek it, and you will find not freedom at the end of your song. Elias rose slowly, his exhaustion tempered by grim purpose. We don't have the luxury of choice. If the stone anchors his power, we have to reach it first, before he gathers strength again. Clara tucked the scorched fragment into her coat. Then we'll follow this map. Through ash, through ruin, whatever waits beneath, we'll face it. Jonas gave a raspy laugh. Let's hope the dead don't sing as loudly as the living. Above them, the wind carried faint echoes, tones too distant to name, as if the city itself awaited their descent. Midnight draped the city in shadows as Elias, Clara, and Jonas stood before the ruins of the old conservatory. Once a grand temple to music, it was now nothing more than scorched stone and blackened pillars. Its roof long since collapsed. Charred beams jutted upward like broken fingers, clawing at the night sky. The air still smelled faintly of soot, as if the fire had never truly died. Elias tightened his grip on the violin, listening. The silence here felt heavier, as though every brick carried the weight of extinguished voices. Helena's presence stirred uneasily in the strings. This place remembers its burning. Be careful, ashes hold more than memory. Clara moved ahead, her lantern casting a pale glow across rubble. She held the scorched fragment of music close, tracing the lines with her finger. The amphitheater should be just beyond this wall. She pointed toward a mound of collapsed stone. If the passage exists, it starts there. Jonas limped after her, dragging his fractured flute like a crutch. And if the conductor knows we're coming, he'll have set guardians. I don't like how quiet this is. They climbed over the debris, dust rising with each step. The amphitheater revealed itself slowly, a wide, circular pit lined with cracked tiers of stone benches, now filled with rubble. Moonlight spilled down, catching in the cracks like silver veins. At its center, half buried under fallen beams, lay a heavy iron grate. Clara knelt, brushing soot away. Symbols were etched into the metal, faint but sharp musical notations twisted into strange patterns. Her brow furrowed. These markings, they're not decoration. They're a lock. Elias crouched beside her, pressing the violin's strings lightly. A low hum answered from the grate, vibrating with unsettling resonance. Helena whispered, "Only music opens this path." Jonas scowled. Music again. Always music. What kind of madman builds a door that sings back? Clara's eyes glimmered. One who wanted the stone hidden forever. Elias placed the violin under his chin, bow poised. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the gravity of what lay ahead. He remembered the conductor's warning, not freedom, but the end of your song. He drew the bow. A single note rang out, echoing through the amphitheater like a ghost returned. The grate trembled, faint light flickering between its bars. Clara's lantern sputtered, flame bending toward the grate as though pulled by the sound. Jonas braced himself, clutching the flute. Elias drew another note, then a third. Each tone unlocked something beneath the ash. The cymbals began to glow, twisting into alignment. The iron grated open with a groan that sounded eerily like a choir exhaling. From the darkness below, a cold draught rushed upward, carrying the faint scent of candle wax and stone long undisturbed. Clara swallowed hard. This is it. The passage to the catacombs. Jonas muttered, or the throat of something hungry. Elias lowered the bow, staring into the abyss. Whatever waited below would decide whether their song ended or truly began. The grate yawned open, exhaling a draught colder than the night air. Elias lifted his lantern, its flicker swallowed almost instantly by the darkness below. Clara went first, gripping the rusted ladder and descending carefully. Jonas followed, muttering curses under his breath as his injured leg protested each step. Elias brought up the rear, violin slung across his back like a shield. The ladder ended in a vast underground chamber, its walls carved from ancient stone blackened by fire. Arched ceilings loomed overhead, their carvings half erased by soot. Candle stubs lined the passageways, long melted but strangely unconsumed, as though time itself had hesitated here. Clara's lantern cast quivering shadows across the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their breathing and the faint scrape of boots on stone. Then, as they stepped deeper, Elias froze. He heard it a whisper, not words at first, but murmurs, countless voices breathing in and out like an invisible tide. Helena stirred anxiously within the violin. The dead sing here, but without melody. Clara noticed his stillness. "What is it?" "Voices," Elias whispered. He tilted his head. "They're everywhere." Jonas spat on the ground. "Wonderful. Haunted basements. Just what we needed." As they advanced, the whispers grew more distinct. They weren't random sounds, they were fragments of song. Snatches of old hymns, broken scales, the hum of rehearsals long forgotten. The catacombs weren't empty. They were filled with echoes of everyone who had ever played or sung within the conservatory, their last notes trapped in stone. The tunnels branched endlessly, forming a labyrinth. Clara pulled out the scorched fragment of music and studied it in the lantern light. The map shows turns. Left at the first arch, down 3 flights, then follow the curve. She glanced up at the endless dark. If this is right, it leads to the heart chamber. They followed the instructions, but the whispers began to change. The voices weren't just random echoes, now they reacted. When Elias's lantern passed, the whispers hushed. When Clara stumbled, they rose in agitated swells. Jonas swore as a low moan reverberated directly behind him, though nothing was there. At one narrow passage, Elias felt a tug at his violin's strings, as though unseen hands brushed across them. A discordant twang filled the air, and instantly the whispers swelled, surrounding them in a deafening chorus of grief. Clara clamped her hands over her ears. "They don't want us here." Helena's voice cut through, fierce despite her fragility. No, they fear what we carry. They know the stone lies ahead. Jonas raised his broken flute like a weapon, eyes darting wildly. Well, fear or not, if these voices start biting, I'm out. Elias steadied his bow. No, we keep going. The conductor's grip begins here. If we turn back now, he wins. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a stairway spiraling downward. From its depths came not whispers, but a steady, resonant hum, a note that had no end. Clara's lantern shook in her hands. That's it, the heart of the catacombs. Elias nodded grimly. Where the stone waits. The stairway spiraled downward like the throat of some colossal beast, each step coated in soot that puffed up with every footfall. Elias's lantern threw shadows that stretched unnaturally long, bending against the walls as though reluctant to follow. The hum from below grew louder, steady and low, vibrating through their bones. At the base, the passage opened into a cavernous hall. The walls curved outward in a perfect circle, their stone surfaces polished to a mirror sheen. Every movement, every breath, echoed with unnatural clarity. Clara's footsteps multiplied into 1,000. Jonas's coughs rolled like thunder, and the faint tremble of Elias's bowstring repeated, endlessly until the chamber felt alive with sound. And there, at the center, it waited, the resonance stone. It was not a jewel, nor a simple relic, but a monolith rising taller than a man. Its surface was black as obsidian, yet it shimmered faintly as though rippling with invisible waves. At its heart pulsed a dull golden glow that beat in rhythm like a living heart. Each pulse sent vibrations through the chamber, and the echoes harmonized with it layer upon layer of resonance until the air itself seemed to sing. Clara stepped forward, awe softening her features. "It's beautiful," Jonas grimaced, gripping the fractured flute. "It's wrong. Stones don't sing. That thing shouldn't exist." Helena's whisper stirred within the violin, her voice trembling with both wonder and dread. "This is the source. The stone remembers every song, every scream. It gives voice to silence, and power to the one who commands it." Elias felt it too. Each pulse seemed to tug at his chest, pulling him closer. His violin vibrated in sympathy, strings thrumming without touch. He had the sickening impression the stone knew him, that it had been waiting. Clara glanced back at him, eyes filled with urgency. If the conductor uses this, the whole city will fall under his control. We have to find a way to sever its link. Jonas snorted. "Sever it? Look at it. You'd need to shatter the moon first." Elias tightened his grip on the bow. Then maybe not shatter, maybe retune. Before Clara could answer, the chamber stirred. The echoes shifted, no longer reflections of their movements, but independent sounds. Laughter, weeping, whispers, voices that did not belong to them filled the air. Shadows crawled across the mirrored stone walls, stretching into vague human shapes. The resonant stone pulsed brighter, and from its glow figures began to emerge translucent, spectral, their mouths moving in silent song. They circled the trio, their eyes empty but fixed. Clara gasped. "The choir?" Helena's voice broke into a cry. "They are bound to the stone trapped, forever in its echo." Elias raised the violin. The bow shook in his hand. "Then we'll free them." The chamber erupted with sound. The chamber quaked as the spectral choir opened their mouths in unison. A torrent of sound burst forth piercing, layered harmonies that stabbed at the skull and twisted in the chest. Elias staggered, pressing the violin tight against him. Clara screamed, clutching her ears, her lantern falling and rolling across the floor. Its flame flared and guttered, casting jagged shadows that danced with the specter's movements. Jonas thrust the fractured flute to his lips and blew. A broken, breathy note shivered into the air, clashing against the choir's perfect pitch. The result was chaos. Vibrations ricocheted off the mirrored walls, doubling, tripling, folding in on themselves until the entire chamber seemed to tremble. Helena's voice rang sharp in Elias's mind. Play. Meet their song, bend it, twist it. Elias lifted the bow. The first note he drew screeched, raw and jagged, cutting across the choir's melody. The spectral figures shuddered, their forms wavering like reflections in disturbed water. Encouraged, he pressed harder, dragging the bow into wild dissonance. The violin's cracks glowed brighter, the wood trembling dangerously. The choir retaliated. Their harmonies shifted, weaving around his discord, trying to smother it beneath sheer weight. The resonance battered his chest like a hammer, his vision blurred, ears ringing with blood. Clara crawled to the lantern, reigniting its light. She held it high, voice hoarse but steady. Elias. The echoes followed the wall's aim at them, not at the stone. Elias adjusted, angling his notes toward the curved surfaces. His discord struck the walls, and the chamber itself began to sing back. The mirrored stone warped the sound, sending it ricocheting around the room in jagged bursts. The choir faltered, their own voices thrown back at them, distorted and grotesque. Several specters shrieked, their forms unraveling into wisps of smoke. Jonas added his breath again, blasting sharp bursts from the broken flute. Though weak, its imperfection tore through the harmonies like cracks in glass. The stone pulsed furiously, trying to hold the choir together. More figures emerged from its glow, swelling the ranks, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide as they poured out their song. Elias felt his strength falter. His arm shook, his bow slick with sweat. Helena's voice urged him on, though fate now, one more push. Turn their harmony into silence. He drew the bow across all strings at once, unleashing a scream of discord that split the chamber like lightning. The mirrored walls roared it back, amplified into a hurricane of sound. The choir convulsed, their forms shattered like glass under strain, bursting into fragments of light that whirled away into the stone. For a moment, silence reclaimed the chamber. Only the steady pulse of the resonant stone remained, louder than ever furious, alive. Clara whispered, trembling, "We heard it, but it's not done with us." The stone's glow flared, filling the chamber with a heartbeat of golden fire. The pulse of the resonance stone quickened, pounding like a war drum. Each beat sent shock waves rippling through the mirrored walls, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. The golden glow at its core expanded, flooding the chamber with a blinding radiance. Clara shielded her eyes, lantern clutched tight against her chest. Jonas stumbled back, his broken flute slipping from his grasp and clattering across the stone. Elias planted his feet, the violin thrumming violently in his arms, as if caught in the stone's rhythm. Helena cried out through the strings. It's a wake it won't allow us to resist again. The monolith shuddered, and from its surface erupted arcs of sound made, solid visible ripples like blades of light. One slashed across the chamber, slicing into the floor and leaving a smoking groove. Another narrowly missed Clara, who fell hard to her knees. "Move!" Elias shouted, dragging her aside as a third ripple crashed into the wall behind them, splintering stone like brittle glass. The resonant stone roared not with words, but with pure vibration. The echoes of the destroyed choir rose again, now twisted into monstrous forms. Dissonant fragments swirled around them, shrieking in pitches too high to bear. Jonas retrieved his flute, hands shaking. "We can't fight that. It's the entire city's voice at once." Elias gritted his teeth. "Then we don't fight it, we redirect it." He raised the bow, drawing a sharp chord. The violin screen clashed with one of the ripples, splitting it meter. The fragments scattered harmlessly into sparks, but the strain nearly wrenched the instrument from his grip, the cracks along its body deepening. Helena whimpered, her essence flickering. Clara's eyes darted to the mirrored walls. The chamber reflects sound. If we can bend its fury back, like a mirror for music, Elias finished. His chest burned with the thought. Another wave of resonance burst forth, tearing toward them. Elias struck a note angled against the wall, sending his discord ricocheting around the chamber. The ripple collided with its own echo, exploding into harmless vibrations that shook their bones but left them standing. The stone pulsed harder, enraged. Dozens of ripples launched at once, a storm of vibrating death. Elias played furiously, deflecting where he could, while Jonas blew ragged bursts through the flute, each note distorting the waves just enough to weaken them. Clara held her lantern high, using its beam to mark the angles where the echoes landed, guiding Elias's aim. Still the assault pressed harder, relentless. The chamber shook, cracks spider-webbing along the ceiling. Dust and stone rained down. Helena's voice rang desperate through the violin. "It cannot be destroyed by force, but perhaps it can be silenced." The idea struck Elias like lightning, not shattered, muted. He lowered the bow, panting. "We have to find its dissonance, the one note it can't endure." The stone glowed hotter, its pulse like thunder, and it was listening. The resonant stone blazed at the center of the chamber, its heartbeat pounding through bone and air alike. Every pulse carried the memory of voices, the city's choirs, orchestras, cries of grief all fused into one endless roar. Elias clutched the violin, chest heaving, while Clara steadied the lantern's beam across the walls. Jonas, pale and sweating, raised the fractured flute, though his breath came ragged. Helena's whisper trembled from the strings. "It cannot be destroyed by strength, only by silence." Elias turned sharply. "Silence? In this storm?" "Not silence of air," she explained, her voice flickering. "Silence of harmony. Every voice has a shadow note play it, and even the loudest song collapses into nothing." Clara's eyes widened. "A resonance that cancels itself. A stone must have one too. A single dissonant frequency it can't withstand." Jonas groaned, leaning heavily on the flute. "So what? We experiment while it's trying to carve us in half." Another ripple erupted from the stone, shrieking across the floor. Elias barely angled a note into the wall in time, splitting it before it struck. Sweat poured down his brow. His violin's body strained under the pressure, glowing with cracks like molten veins. Clara hurried to the mirrored wall, pressing her palm against the stone. The chamber reflects sound perfectly. If we can send the right note into it, the walls will amplify the collapse. Elias hesitated, bow hovering over strings. But what's the right note? Helena's voice softened. I don't know, but the stone does. Listen, Elias. Beneath the roar is its true pitch. Find it and play its death. He closed his eyes. The thunder of resonance rattled his skull. But beneath it, fate, buried, was a tone. A low vibration, steady and unyielding, almost too deep to hear. I've got it, Elias whispered. But it's dangerous. If I play it wrong, the violin might. Trust me, Helena urged. We've come this far together. End it with me if you must. Ilias's grip tightened. He raised the bow and drew a trembling note across the lowest string. The chamber responded instantly. The walls groaned, the lantern's flame bent, and the stone itself pulsed erratically as though struck in the chest. The choir of echoes screamed in protest, erupting from the walls in a frenzy. Jonas blew sharp counterbursts, scattering them. Clara shouted over the chaos. It's working. Elias again. He adjusted the pitch, inching closer to the buried note. The stone flickered violently, cracks glowing across its surface. Each adjustment strained the violin further, Helena's voice gasping with every stroke. Finally he found it a frequency so perfect in its opposition that the chamber itself seemed to hold its breath. The stone shuddered, its glow collapsing inward, fighting to endure. Elias drew the bow harder, forcing the note into the walls. The resonant stone roared. The chamber quaked like the heart of a collapsing world. Elias's bow pressed into the strings, dragging out the note that gnawed at the stone's very core. The walls shook with violent resonance, dust raining down in sheets. The golden glow of the monolith faltered, rippling like water struck by a storm. Helena's voice shivered through the violin, half a sob, half a plea. You've found it the fracture in its song. But Elias? My body can't endure much longer. Elias's arms trembled, sweat pouring down his face. He tightened his grip. We don't stop. If you break, I'll break with you. But we end this. The note drilled into the stone, each vibration peeling layers of its harmony apart. The once solid roar of voices splintered into chaos screams, laughter, sobs, thousands of sounds, unraveling into a storm of broken memory. The chamber pulsed with agony, as if the very earth howled in pain. Jonas stumbled forward, raising the fractured flute. His eyes burned with determination. You're not doing this alone. He blew, forcing jagged bursts into Elias's rhythm, strengthening the collapse. The flute cracked further with every note, but Jonas didn't stop. Clara held the lantern high, her voice steady despite the cacophony. Keep it steady. The wall reflections are aligning. Don't let it slip. The stone retaliated. Beams of resonance lashed out in desperation, slamming into the walls, gouging the floor. One struck near Clara, throwing her back in a spray of rubble. Ilias's chest seized with panic, but she lifted her lantern weakly, nodding. I'm fine. Finish it. The violin screamed. Its cracks split wide, glowing as Helena poured the last of herself into the strings. One more stroke, Elias. Pour everything, your grief, your anger, your defiance. Give it all to me, and I'll give it back tenfold. Elias drew the bow with a cry torn from his soul. The note surged, deeper and sharper, colliding perfectly with the stone's hidden pitch. The chamber thundered as the frequency met its twin and devoured it. The resonance stone convulsed, fissures spider webbing across its surface. Its glow erupted wildly, lashing the chamber with violent bursts of light. The choir of echoes shrieked in unison, dissolving into smoke as their prison fractured. Helena screamed with them, her voice piercing Elias's mind. "I can't hold Elias." The violin's body cracked fully, splitting down its length. Elias clutched it desperately, tears streaking his ash-stained face. "Stay with me just a little longer." The stone gave one final, catastrophic pulse. The sound was not a note, but a scream, the scream of every voice it had ever stolen. Then the monolith shattered, fragments exploding outward like shards of black glass, dissolving before they touched the ground. The chamber fell into silence. Not the silence of death, but of something finally freed. Elias stood trembling, staring at the fractured violin in his hands. Its strings sagged, its glow dim. Helena's voice was gone. For the first time, Elias felt truly alone. The chamber lay in ruins, its once vibrating walls, now nothing more than fractured stone. Dust floated like faint snow, settling on jagged rubble and the scorched earth where the resonant stone had stood. The golden glow that had once dominated the cavern was gone. In its place stretched a heavy silence absolute, suffocating, final. Elias stood in the middle of it, clutching the broken violin to his chest. His fingers dug into the splintered wood, refusing to let go, as though his grip alone could call Helena's voice back into being. His heart thundered with disbelief. The space in his mind where she had lived for weeks was empty. No whisper, no laugh, no guiding tone, nothing. "Helena?" His voice cracked, desperate. "Say something, anything." But only silence answered. Jonas collapsed beside him, coughing violently, blood streaking his lips. The shattered remains of the flute fell from his trembling hands. He managed a hoarse laugh, more pain than humor. "Well, it's over. The damn thing's gone." Clara stumbled toward them, her lantern dim but still flickering. She was bruised, her arm bloodied where the stone's lash had struck, but her grip on the light remained steady. She looked at Elias, at the violin pressed to his chest, and her face fell. She's not there, is she?" Elias's jaw tightened. His throat burned as though strangled by his own grief. He shook his head. She gave everything to break it. "She's gone." The silence pressed harder, wrapping around him like iron chains. He could feel despair gnawing at the edges of his mind. For weeks, Helena had been his companion, his guide, his strength. Now, stripped of her voice, he was just Elias Ward, again alone in a broken chamber, with nothing but dust and sorrow. Jonas shifted weakly, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Listen, maybe she's gone, but what she did, it freed them. The voices, the ones trapped in that thing, they're not screaming anymore. That means something." Clara knelt before Elias, her lantern casting soft shadows over his hollow eyes. "She trusted you. If she gave herself, it was because she knew you'd carry her story forward." Elias looked down at the violin. Its cracks glowed faintly, the last embers of Helena's presence fading like a dying star. He pressed his forehead to the broken strings, closing his eyes. "Then I'll carry her," he whispered. "As long as I live, I'll carry her." The chamber gave no reply. Only silence remained. But outside, somewhere above the earth, the world was breathing again. The climb back through the labyrinth felt endless. The path that had carried them down in dread now stretched upward with the weight of exhaustion. Every step Elias took echoed hollowly in his chest, as though the silence clung to him even here. He still carried the violin, cradled against him like a wounded child. Its cracks caught the lantern's light in faint glimmers, but no voice whispered from its strings. Jonas limped ahead, leaning heavily on a shard of stone he had fashioned into a makeshift cane. Each movement drew a grunt of pain from him, but he refused to stop. Clara walked at his side, lantern in hand, illuminating the treacherous ground. Her determination was steady, though her eyes flicked constantly back to Elias, watching the way grief had bent his frame. When they finally reached the last ascent, the air shifted. The oppressive dampness of the underground gave way to the sharp bite of night wind. Clara raised the lantern, and for the first time in hours, they saw the mouth of the cavern-open sky beyond, silvered by the waning moon. As they emerged, the world greeted them with a sound none of them had expected. Quiet. Not the suffocating silence of the chamber, but a gentler hush, as though the city itself was resting after a long fever. The ever-present hum of the resonance, the low vibration that had haunted the streets, gone unnoticed by many, but always felt was gone. The air was clean. The night carried only the sounds of leaves, trembling in the breeze, and the distant flow of water. Clara gasped softly, clutching the lantern closer. "Do you feel it? It's lighter. Like the city, it's breathing again." Jonas sank down on a nearby rock, laughing raggedly through his exhaustion. "Damn right it is. That stone was like a parasite. We cut it out." He wiped blood from his chin with the back of his hand, then looked to Elias. "Doesn't mean we didn't lose something worth more." Elias said nothing. His gaze was fixed on the skyline of the city in the distance. The rooftops glowed faintly under the moon, peaceful in a way he had never seen before. And yet, within him, the emptiness was unbearable. The violin pressed to his chest was no longer an instrument of partnership, it was a tombstone. Clara stepped beside him, laying a hand gently on his arm. "She saved them, Elias, the voices, the city, and she saved us. You can't let her sacrifice turn into just another wound you carry alone." Elias closed his eyes, listening to the night. For the first time since meeting Helena, he could not hear her. Only the world's silence remained, and in that silence he made a vow. "I'll keep walking," he murmured. "For her. For all of them. This isn't the end." The city waited below, changed, freed, but holding secrets still. The city felt different the moment they set foot back on its cobbled streets. Elias had walked these alleys countless times, but never had they sounded like this, empty of the faint hum that had once pressed into every wall and whispered from every window. For years he hadn't noticed it fully. It had been background noise, a constant vibration woven into the fabric of life. Now that it was gone, its absence was startling. Clara stopped in the middle of the street, raising her lantern. Its warm glow flickered across the shuttered doors of silent shops and the cobblestones slick with midnight dew. "Listen," she whispered. "It's so quiet. It feels unreal." Elias tilted his head. The quiet was not complete. Beneath the hush, the city itself seemed to be exhaling. From open windows, he caught fragments, a child's peaceful breathing, the soft turn of a page, even the faint hum of someone singing themselves to sleep. Ordinary sounds, fragile and real. They had been drowned out before, but not everything was peaceful. As they passed through the marketplace, Elias noticed figures lingering at corners, their faces drawn, their movements unsteady. Some clutched their heads as though disoriented. Others muttered incoherently, their voices strained with echoes of melodies that no one else could hear. Jonas paused, frowning. The stone's gone, but its grip. It left scars. He limped closer to one of the muttering figures, a man kneeling by a fountain, rocking back and forth. The man's eyes were wide, unblinking, and from his mouth spilled broken phrases, half songs, half cries. Elias crouched beside him. "You can hear them, can't you?" he asked gently. The man looked at him as though through water. "The music, it doesn't stop, it won't stop," his voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. Clara's heart clenched. She whispered to Elias, "The stone kept them prisoner. Now they're free, but not all of them can live with what they heard." Elias nodded grimly. "Resonance doesn't just vanish. It lingers, and some of these people carried it too long." He rose, staring down the length of the street. "The orchestra may be silent, but the echoes remain." Jonas leaned on his cane, eyes narrowing. "Which means this isn't over, does it? Something this big doesn't just die clean." Elias held the broken violin tighter, its cracked body brushing his palm. The faint warmth that once guided him was gone, but in its silence he felt responsibility settle heavier than ever. "No," he said softly. "This is the beginning of something else. And if Helena gave herself to M. the Stone, then I have to face what comes next. For her and for them." The city was free, yes, but freedom carried its own kind of weight, and Elias Ward was already bracing to bear it. Word of the stone's destruction spread through the city like wildfire. By dawn, whispers had reached every district. Some spoke of an earthquake, others of a miracle, still others of a terrible curse broken at last. No one knew the truth, not fully, but they all knew one thing: the music that had haunted their nights was gone. For Elias, Clara, and Jonas, the respite was brief. Before the sun had fully risen, a group of uniformed guards appeared at the door of the small inn, where they had taken shelter. Their leader, a sharp-eyed woman with a polished saber at her side, delivered the message with practiced formality. "The council requests your presence, immediately." Elias had expected this. Power never tolerated mysteries for long. Still, he felt the weight of the broken violin strapped across his back, a hollow reminder of what had been lost. He exchanged a look with Clara and Jonas. Neither spoke, but both nodded. They had come too far to turn away now. The council chamber was vast, its ceiling arched high and painted with fading murals of the city's founding. Rows of torches burned along the walls, filling the air with the scent of oil and smoke. At the far end sat 7 figures, robed in dark silks, their faces lined with authority and suspicion. The eldest counselor, a man with a voice as cold as polished stone, leaned forward. "Elias Ward, you stand before us as the man most closely tied to the collapse. Beneath our city, reports speak of light tremors and voices. Explain yourself." Elias met their gaze, his back straight despite the exhaustion clawing at his bones. "What you heard, what you felt, it was the death of something that should never have existed. A stone that fed on sound and memory. It is gone now, but its echoes remain." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. One counselor, younger and sharper-eyed than the rest, narrowed his gaze. "You admit to destroying it? Then tell us, what price did you pay? For power like that never leaves quietly." Elias's grip tightened on the violin strap. "The price was paid," he said, his voice rough, "by someone braver than any of us here, and I won't let her sacrifice be twisted into rumor or fear." The eldest counselor's eyes flickered, perhaps with doubt, perhaps with recognition of the grief in Elias's tone. "Be careful, detective. The people may see you as a savior or as the one who unleashed something worse." As they were dismissed, Clara whispered, "They don't trust you." Elias gave a thin smile. "Good. Distrust will keep them watchful. And I need them watchful. Because Jonas was right. This isn't over." The council had demanded answers. But Elias knew the city's true questions lay elsewhere in the alleys, the homes, and the hearts of those still haunted by the stone's song. And soon those questions would come knocking. Night returned to the city with an unfamiliar gentleness. For the first time in decades, the streets did not hum with invisible tension. No phantom orchestra stalked the alleys. No dissonant chords drifted through dreams. The air was still, clean, quiet, and yet Elias Ward could not rest. He sat alone on the roof of the inn, the fractured violin across his knees. The cracks caught the moonlight, faint glimmers etched into ruined wood. He traced them with calloused fingers, as though searching for Helena's voice hidden in the grain. But the strings remained cold. Clara climbed up beside him, her lantern swinging softly. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she lowered herself onto the tiles and simply sat with him, her presence a steady warmth against the chill night. After a long silence, she said quietly, "The city is free." "Elias, you gave them that." Elias shook his head. "Helena gave them that. I only followed the path she lit." He looked out across the rooftops, the lanterns burning in windows, the faint laughter drifting from taverns where people celebrated unknowingly. But freedom isn't the end. You've seen it, those broken by the stone's song. They'll need more than silence to heal. Jonas's voice carried from the ladder below. Then we help them. That's what's left for us, isn't it? To pick up the pieces. He hauled himself onto the roof, grimacing as his bad leg caught. "Besides, you're a detective, Elias. You can't help yourself. The moment the city whispers, you'll be listening." Elias almost smiled. Almost. He set the violin gently into its case, closing the lid with a quiet finality. "She told me once that music is never truly gone. It leaves echoes in the people who hear it. That means Helena's still here. In me. In you. In this city." The three of them sat together beneath the silver wash of moonlight. Around them, the city stirred hesitant but alive. Somewhere a lullaby drifted from an open window, soft and imperfect, yet achingly human. Elias straightened, the weight of grief shifting into something sharper, steadier. He looked at Clara, at Jonas, at the city sprawled before them. The silent orchestra is over, but whatever comes next, whatever echoes remain, I'll face them. Not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a man who owes a promise. He lifted his gaze to the stars, his voice steady. I'll carry her voice. I'll carry them all, and I will not stop listening. The city, freed at last, breathed with him. Its silence was no longer empty. It was waiting, and Elias Ward, detective of the unseen, was ready to answer.